Hey, what's up guys? Brian Kelly here from Zombie Guitar. Here in today's video I want to talk about numbering chord progressions. More specifically, I want to talk about minor chord progressions. So when it comes to numbering minor chord progressions, there's always going to be two ways that you can think about it. You can think about it from the major perspective or the minor perspective. It's important to understand both. It's important to understand why you may want to use one way of numbering versus the other way. I'm going to explain all of that stuff in this video. The most important thing to understand is that this is all just theory. This is all just on paper stuff. If I play something that's written in a minor key, the listener is going to have no idea how I am numbering the chord progressions. The listener is not going to say, hey, that's supposed to be a 1 chord. Why are you calling it the 6 chord? It makes no difference to what the listener hears. This is all just on paper stuff, but I want you to understand it, so that's why I'm making this video. So before we get started with this lesson, I just want to give a quick plug about my website, zombieguitar.com. So that is the website that I've been building for 7 years now. Just this past Friday, I launched the new and improved version of the website. Completely new look, completely new feel, improved navigation. All of the courses have been reshot, so better video and audio quality for all the courses. The site's just a million bazillion times better. I don't even know if bazillion's a number, but it's that much better. So if you haven't already seen the new and improved zombieguitar.com, take a look at that. Link to that is below. Thanks for listening to my plug. Let's get on to the lesson. All right, so for this lesson, I'm going to use the key signature of G major to give these examples. The reason I'm going to use this key signature is because it contains a sharp. So typically you can explain music theory from the key signature of C major because it contains no sharps or flats in it, but it might not make the whole concept of rearranging and viewing the key signature from the minor perspective quite as obvious as if it has some sharps in it. So I'm going to use this key signature of G major, which contains one sharp. That way, once we rearrange it and we view the key signature from the minor perspective, it's going to be a little bit more obvious. So the key signature of G major, which is based off of the G major scale, is G, A, B, C, D, E, and F sharp. Those are the 7 notes of the G major scale. Those are the 7 notes that are found in this particular key signature. So each of the 7 chords that are in this key signature is based off one of the 7 notes. So 7 notes, 7 chords. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So any given key signature is going to have 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and 1 diminished chord in it. In the key signature of G major, these are those 7 chords. So if I wanted to play a chord progression and I'm in the key of G major, I could just look at these 7 chords and place and just make up a chord progression. So let's say I want to play a 1, 5, 6, 4 chord progression. All right, so let's say I wanted to play a chord progression in the key of E minor. So for every major key, there's a relative minor key. For every minor key, there's a relative major key. So the relative minor of G major is E minor. The relative major of E minor is G major. There's always going to be 12 major minor pairs. G major, E minor is the one major minor pair that we're looking at for this lesson. So in the key of E minor, you have the same 7 chords available. You have the same 7 notes available. Everything about E minor and G major is 100% identical, with the difference being that when you're in the key of G major, the G major chord is your home chord, is your tonal center chord. When you're in the key of E minor, the E minor chord is your tonal center, your home chord. So if I want to write a chord progression in the key of E minor, I have these same 7 chords available to me. Let's say I want to use the E minor chord, the D major chord, and the C major chord. All right, so I used 3 of the chords, but I could have used any of the other chords that are part of this key signature, and it would have been an E minor chord progression. Just as long as I made that E minor chord to be my home chord, I kind of ended that chord progression on that. It kind of felt like home. It kind of felt like the tonal center. Therefore, it was an E minor chord progression. So if I wanted to number that from the major perspective, I would have called the E minor chord the 6 chord. I would have called the D major chord the 5 chord. I would have called the C major chord the 4 chord. So I could have called that a 6, 5, 4 progression. In my personal opinion, if all of the chords are 100% part of the key, if there's no out-of-key chords being used at all, as was the case just now, I personally like to think of it in my mind from the major perspective. It makes sense to me to just think, okay, E minor is 6, D major is 5, C major is 4 in this particular key. if there's other out-of-key chords that are started to be thrown into the mix, which we're going to get to in a second, then it might make more sense to renumber the chords and label them from the minor perspective. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the key of E minor, but we're going to number it from the minor perspective. So E minor is now going to be called the 1 chord. E minor is the tonal center. It's the key of E minor, so we're going to call the E minor the 1 chord. We then have to rearrange the numbering of all the rest of the chords. So remember that all the rest of the chords are still the same exact chords that are part of the key of G major, because E minor, G major are a relative major-minor pair. It's just that we have to renumber things since we're now calling E minor the 1 chord. So lowercase Roman numerals are minor chords, uppercase Roman numerals are major chords. So when you renumber the chords this way, there's going to be 2 ways of doing it. This is why things get confusing when you rearrange the numbering for the minor perspective. You can number the chords based off the scale formula, or you can just simply assign numbers 1 through 7 to each of the chords. I personally like to do it based off the scale formula because then that keeps everything making sense mathematically. So the scale formula for a natural minor scale is 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. So that's the way that I like to number things when it's numbered based on the minor perspective. Some people will do it a bit differently. Some people will just say that it's the 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, 4 chord, 5, 6, and 7. They'll just omit the flat stuff. To me, that kind of adds a little bit of extra confusion into the mix. I don't really like to do things that way. But when people number chord progressions based off the minor perspective, sometimes they'll keep those flats in there such that it coincides with the natural minor scale formula. Sometimes they won't keep those flats in there. I like to keep it coinciding with the scale formula. That way everything is mathematically accurate. That way everything kind of makes sense in my mind. All right. So if I wanted to play the same chord progression, this E minor to D major to C major, now we're just going to call this a 1, flat 7, flat 6 chord progression. So E minor is the 1 chord, D major is the flat 7 chord, and then C major is the flat 6 chord. If I wanted to number it the other way, where I omitted the flats, I could just call this a 1, 7, 6 chord progression. Whatever way you choose to do it, just understand that E minor is the 1. All the rest of the chords have been renumbered accordingly. So the benefits of renumbering the chord progressions based on the minor perspective become apparent once you start including out-of-key chords into the mix. So when you're in a minor key, like in this case we're in the key of E minor, it's very, very common to take the 5th chord in relation to the 1st chord, which we're now calling E minor, that's our 1st chord. It's very common to take the 5th chord, which diatonically would be a minor 5 chord, and make that major. So that's a very, very common thing to do in minor keys, and therefore if you're kind of using that major 5 chord in the context of E minor, or if you're using any other out-of-key chords in the context of E minor, it kind of makes sense to rearrange the numbering. That way you know that E is your 1, any chords in relation to your 1 are numbered such that E is still your 1. So let's do like a 1, flat 7, flat 6, 5 chord progression. So I threw that B major chord in there, and that is very, very commonly done in a minor key context. That 5 chord is made into a major chord. So the reason that that is done is because that is known as the dominant chord. 5 chord in music is just known as the dominant chord. The 1 chord is your home chord, your tonal center, your tonic chord. So 5 chord always leads back to the 1 chord. This is why it makes sense to kind of think when you're in a minor key context, to think in terms of that E minor chord as being your 1 chord now. So if you want, you can still label that chord progression from the major perspective. It's not going to change anything from what the people hear. So you can call the E minor chord the 6th chord, the D major chord the 5 chord, the C major chord the 4 chord, and then the B chord the 3 chord. When it's made into a major chord, we're making that alteration. It becomes a major 3 chord. So it's still the same exact 4 chords. The listener is not going to hear one bit of difference. The listener is not going to know, hey, that E minor chord was called a 6 chord there. It's supposed to be called a 1 chord. The listener is not going to hear anything different. It's just that this whole dominant, this whole 5-1 cadence thing is not quite as apparent when you are viewing from the major perspective. When you're viewing the numbering from the minor perspective, it's very, very apparent. You say, okay, there's your 5 chord, there's your 1 chord, there's that cadence that's happening. That's the benefit of understanding the minor numbering. So both are super important to understand, in my opinion. So if all of the chords are 100% in key, there's no out of key chords being used, in my mind, I like to just kind of think of everything from the major perspective. It's easy. There's only one numbering system to remember. But if we're writing in a minor key and there's out of key chords being used, especially that major 5 chord being thrown into the mix, then I like to switch up my numbering in my mind. I'm like, okay, there's that 5 chord, there's that 1 chord. You have to understand both. You really have to understand both. You're going to see it written both ways, and then even when it comes to this minor numbering, you're still going to see that written in 2 different ways. You're going to see it based off this natural minor scale formula, 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. You're also going to see them numbered just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but from the minor perspective. So this stuff will be confusing if you don't understand the fundamentals. That's why I'm always trying to say, you got to understand the fundamentals. You have to understand key signatures. You have to understand how music fits together into a key signature. Once you understand that stuff, major perspective, minor perspective, it all makes perfect sense. All right, so hopefully this was helpful to you guys. Thanks for watching. See you next time.